What if one careless moment of arrogance was enough to destroy a man's empire? Imagine a glittering ballroom in New York, filled with powerful executives, investors and journalists, where every gesture is watched, every word magnified. In this world of prestige and luxury, a single act of humiliation becomes the spark that lights a fire no one can control. This is the story of Robert Hayes, a director at the peak of his career, admired by some, feared by others. But on the night that was meant to celebrate his empire, his pride led him to humiliate a simple waiter. What Robert didn't know was that the man he mocked carried the key to his downfall. Stay with me until the end of this story, because here, in the clash between arrogance and truth, you'll see how even the smallest voice can topple the mightiest of giants. Robert Hayes sat at the top floor of a glass tower that pierced the Manhattan skyline. His office overlooked the city like a throne above subjects, and he treated it as such. To his employees, Robert was a man to be feared, sharp, ambitious, and merciless. He spoke of profits and expansion as if they were commandments, and no one dared question him. The board adored him for his results, ignoring the arrogance that fueled his success. He believed power was not something earned, but something taken. Every handshake was a transaction, every smile a calculation. Robert had perfected the art of appearing invincible, presenting himself as a man without weakness. His voice filled boardrooms, and his presence silenced opposition before a word was spoken. He wore his pride like armor, never suspecting it could also become his downfall. The company's gala was approaching, a night designed to showcase wealth, influence, and control. Investors, politicians, and journalists would attend, eager to celebrate Robert's leadership. He saw the event not as a celebration, but as a performance. Every detail, from the music to the menu, was orchestrated to reinforce his image of dominance. It was his stage, and he was the star. For Robert, employees were tools, nothing more. Waiters, assistants, secretaries, they existed to serve his ambition. He never paused to see the humanity in them, never considered that respect might be earned through kindness. To him, authority meant reminding others of their place. The gala would be no exception. He intended to leave everyone in awe of his power. As the night approached, Robert rehearsed his speech with the confidence of a king. He spoke of innovation, of legacy, of the company's unmatched reach across the globe. Every phrase was designed to draw applause and admiration. What he did not realize was that pride had blinded him. The smallest crack could break the illusion he fought so hard to protect. And on that night, under chandeliers brighter than stars, the crack would come from the last place Robert expected, not from rivals or board members, but from a man he never even saw as worthy of his attention. Michael Reed buttoned his black vest in the small break room of the hotel. To most guests, he would be invisible, just another waiter blending into the background of luxury. He had learned to move quietly, balancing trays with precision, answering politely but never lingering. It was the kind of work that went unnoticed unless a mistake was made. Yet Michael saw everything. His silence gave him eyes sharper than most. He was young, in his early 20s, but life had already forced him to grow fast. Supporting his mother and younger sister, Michael took every job he could find. He served drinks at weddings, carried plates at banquets, and swept floors at midnight shifts. To him, work was survival, but it was also opportunity. He watched people closely, learning from their words, their arrogance, their mistakes. Unlike the guests he served, Michael did not measure success in money or power. For him, it was measured in dignity, the ability to hold his head high despite hardship. That belief had carried him through years of exhaustion and sacrifice. He didn't crave luxury, but he despised cruelty. And when he saw arrogance, he remembered every moment someone had tried to make him feel small. That night, when he stepped into the ballroom carrying trays of champagne, he already knew who Robert Hayes was. He had read articles, overheard conversations, and even seen internal papers discarded carelessly by executives at other events. Michael knew more about the company than anyone assumed. He was invisible, but invisibility had given him access. He moved quietly among the tables, watching as powerful men and women laughed under the golden light. Their words carried arrogance, their laughter sharp. Michael felt the familiar mix of humility and defiance. He was a servant tonight, yes, but he was also a witness, and witnesses remembered. What he didn't yet know was that before the night ended, he would no longer be invisible. One act of humiliation would push him into the spotlight, and the truths he carried in silence would turn into the weapon that toppled a giant. The gala had been planned for months, each detail carefully chosen to project prestige. The ballroom of the Grand Astoria Hotel would host the event, its crystal chandeliers casting golden light across polished marble floors. Invitations had been sent to senators, investors, CEOs, and influential journalists. For Robert Hayes, it was more than a celebration. It was a stage to remind the world of his dominance. Robert's staff worked tirelessly, arranging decorations, seating charts, and a menu worthy of royalty. He oversaw the plans with a perfectionist's eye, snapping at assistants who hesitated and firing those who made even the smallest mistake. For him, nothing less than flawless execution was acceptable. The night had to glorify him, not the company, not the shareholders, only Robert. In his office, Robert rehearsed his speech in front of the mirror. His words were crafted like weapons, designed to win admiration and silence critics. He spoke of global expansion, of innovation, of legacies that would outlast nations. Every line was designed not only to impress, but to elevate him above everyone else in the room. He believed his voice would echo long after the applause. Meanwhile, Michael Reed prepared in a different way. He ironed his uniform in the staff quarters, polished his shoes until they shone, and tied his apron carefully. To him, it was another job, long hours, aching feet, but steady pay. Still, he knew this event carried more weight. Serving the most powerful people in the city meant every move had to be perfect. A single mistake could cost him his position. The hotel manager reminded the waiters to be invisible. Move quietly, speak only when spoken to, and remember, guests are gods tonight. Michael listened silently, nodding like the others, but inside his thoughts were different. He respected his work, but he did not believe any man deserved to be treated as a god. He knew the powerful bled the same as everyone else. As the final preparations were made, the contrast between Robert and Michael sharpened. One saw the night as his coronation, the other as survival. Neither man could have predicted how their worlds would collide, or how a single moment would change both of their lives forever. The Grand Astoria shimmered like a palace as limousines lined up at its entrance. Flashbulbs from reporters' cameras lit up the night, capturing the arrival of New York's elite. Women in sequined gowns and men in tailored suits filled the red carpet, each arrival a spectacle of wealth. Inside, the orchestra played softly, and glasses of champagne sparkled in the hands of the powerful. Robert entered last, timed deliberately so all eyes would be on him. His presence commanded attention. His tailored suit, his confident stride, his self-assured smile. Guests applauded as if his arrival were the main event. Robert thrived in the spotlight, shaking hands, delivering charming remarks, and accepting praise that fueled his pride. This was his kingdom, and he was the reigning king. Michael moved silently through the glittering hall, carrying trays of champagne. He passed between groups of laughing executives, invisible except for the drinks he offered. His movements were precise, his face expressionless, but his eyes caught everything. He noticed the way investors whispered, the way journalists scribbled notes, the way Robert basked in their admiration. The night was a performance, and Robert was the star. Conversations echoed across the ballroom, discussions of billion-dollar deals, political favors, and international influence. Robert's name was on everyone's lips. spoken with respect, envy, or fear. He soaked it in like oxygen, raising his glass in self-congratulation. For him, the night was proof of his untouchable power. No one dared challenge him. Michael, however, felt the imbalance. He saw how waiters bowed under sharp commands, how assistants rushed nervously at Robert's beckoning. He had witnessed arrogance before, but something about Robert's pride stood apart. It was colder, heavier, almost cruel. Michael carried his tray with quiet patience, but in his chest, a fire flickered. The orchestra swelled as Robert prepared to take the stage. Laughter filled the room, champagne glasses clinked, and pride swirled like perfume in the air. But hidden in that glittering hall, beneath the glow of chandeliers, the first shadows of disaster were already waiting. The orchestra softened as Robert stepped onto the stage, his glass raised high. He welcomed investors, praised politicians, and promised that his company's future would shape the very fabric of technology. Applause rolled across the room, cameras flashing like lightning. Robert smiled, soaking in the admiration. He was certain nothing could tarnish his perfect night. Then, as Michael crossed behind him with a tray of champagne, a glass slipped from the edge. It hit the floor, shattering in a burst of crystal. The room froze, the silence sharp and immediate. All eyes turned, not to Robert's speech, but to the young waiter crouching quickly to clean the shards. Robert's jaw tightened. Instead of ignoring the mistake, he seized the moment. "This," he sneered, pointing at Michael, "is the problem with people today. Incompetence, worthlessness. Even when serving drinks, they fail." Laughter erupted from some guests, eager to echo Robert's disdain. Others shifted uncomfortably, the cruelty souring the air. Michael's face burned, but he said nothing at first. He gathered the shards, his hands steady, despite the sting of embarrassment. Robert continued, smirking at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize. Even the staff can't rise to the standards of tonight. But then again, not everyone is built for excellence." His words cut deeper than the broken glass. For the first time, the gala felt uneasy. A few whispers stirred in the back, investors glancing at one another. Journalists scribbled notes, sensing a headline. Olivia from PR winced, but no one dared confront Robert. His arrogance was as heavy as the chandeliers above them, hanging over the room. And just as arrogance reached its peak, let me pause here, because this moment marks the beginning of a downfall. If you're following this story and don't want to miss the twists ahead, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. That way, you'll always be here when the next chapter of truth unfolds. Michael rose slowly, holding the empty tray at his side. His heart pounded, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "With respect, sir," he said, his words slicing through the silence, "not everyone here has failed. Some of us have simply been ignored." The room gasped. Waiters never spoke back, certainly not to Robert Hayes. Robert's eyes narrowed, his smirk faltering. "Excuse me," he barked, but Michael didn't shrink. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze meeting Robert's without fear. "I've worked these halls for years," Michael continued, "and I've seen things. Documents left behind, conversations overheard, secrets whispered. You mock me tonight, but I know truths that could shame this company far more than a broken glass." The ballroom erupted in murmurs. Investors leaned closer, whispering nervously. Journalists lifted their pens again, eyes gleaming. Robert waved a dismissive hand, laughing too loudly. "He's just a boy serving drinks. Pay him no mind." But his voice cracked, and that tiny fracture was enough for the audience to sense weakness. Michael stood tall, his tray trembling only slightly in his grip. "Respect isn't bought with money or titles," he said. "It's earned by how you treat people. And tonight, everyone here has seen exactly what kind of man you are." His words echoed, heavier than Robert's speech. Reaching corners of the hall, pride had never touched. The orchestra remained frozen, the music long forgotten. Guests exchanged glances, some disgusted, some intrigued. Robert's empire had never been questioned in public before, but now, under the golden glow of chandeliers, his image had cracked wide open. And in that moment, Michael Reed stopped being invisible. He was no longer just a waiter in a black vest. He had become the voice that dared to challenge the giant, and the first spark that would set the empire aflame. The silence that followed Michael's words was deafening. Guests shifted in their seats, torn between disbelief and curiosity. Some expected him to retreat, to apologize and leave. But Michael's gaze didn't waver. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Notes he had collected while working countless corporate events. His voice was steady as he began to read. "Project Aegis," he said, his tone clear. "A contract signed off books, paid to shell companies with no accountability. Inflated figures, hidden kickbacks, disguised as consulting fees. I've seen the paperwork myself." Gasps echoed across the hall. Journalists scribbling furiously as the names of projects and numbers spilled into the air. Robert froze, his smile locked like glass about to shatter. "You're lying!" Robert snapped, his hand slamming against the podium. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Investors exchanged glances, whispers rising. Some recognized the names Michael mentioned. Projects they had been assured were legitimate. Their confidence in Robert began to slip. The arrogance that once inspired fear now revealed cracks of doubt. Michael folded the paper, holding it firmly at his side. "I'm just a waiter, yes," he continued, "but I've watched, I've listened, and I've learned. You call me incompetent, but I've seen the truth you hide, and the truth doesn't care how expensive your suit is." His words struck harder than the clinking of shattered glass. The room rippled with unease. A senator in the front row shifted uncomfortably, recognizing his own signature on a deal Michael referenced. A journalist texted furiously under the table, no doubt sending headlines to editors. Investors pulled out their phones, scanning emails and contracts, searching for signs that what Michael said might be real. Robert tried to regain control, forcing a laugh. "You believe him? A waiter?" he barked. But his words no longer landed with authority. Pride had blinded him for so long that he didn't realize the balance of power was shifting. The room that once worshipped him was now listening to someone he had tried to humiliate. Within minutes, the gala turned from celebration to interrogation. Guests who once lined up to praise Robert now whispered openly about betrayal and fraud. The golden light of the chandeliers suddenly felt harsh, revealing every crack in his carefully polished image. What had been laughter moments earlier was now suspicion, heavy and sharp. Journalists began to swarm, their cameras flashing, their microphones reaching. "Mr. Hayes, is it true? What about the offshore accounts? Do you deny these accusations?" Robert barked back denials, his voice rising, but each word sounded weaker. The louder he spoke, the less convincing he became. The empire he had built on control was unraveling before his eyes. Investors, furious and alarmed, pulled out their phones to call their offices. Deals were cancelled in real time. Contracts dissolved before dessert was even served. Shares of the company began to dip within the hour, as news outlets live-streamed the chaos from inside the ballroom. By the time Robert left the stage, his empire had already begun to crumble. Michael stood silently to the side, his role complete for the moment. He hadn't revealed everything he knew, only enough to spark the storm. Yet he could feel the eyes of the room on him, not with pity, but with awe. The waiter no one had noticed before was now the name everyone would remember. Invisible no longer, he had spoken truth to power. Robert's allies began to distance themselves, slipping away from the ballroom without a word. Politicians who once clung to his influence now turned their backs. Even colleagues who had defended him stood in silence, unwilling to share the shame. Robert Hayes, once untouchable, stood alone in the glare of 100 eyes that no longer admired him. As the orchestra sat frozen with instruments in hand, one truth became undeniable. Arrogance had built the walls of Robert's empire, but honesty had just torn them down. And what started with a broken glass had become a firestorm too powerful to stop. Robert stormed off the stage, his face flushed crimson under the golden lights. Guests parted like water as he passed, their murmurs following him like shadows. He barked orders to his assistants, demanding they silence the waiter immediately, but none moved. Fear of him had turned into fear for themselves. The empire that once inspired loyalty was dissolving into panic. He spun back toward the crowd, shouting, "None of this is true. He's a liar, a nobody." His voice cracked, and the silence that followed was louder than any applause. Journalists scribbled faster, capturing every word of denial as evidence of desperation. Robert's certainty, once ironclad, was now brittle glass. The crowd no longer saw a titan. They saw a man unraveling. Michael remained calm, standing quietly with the other servers. He didn't need to speak. Robert's rage was proof enough of guilt. The young waiter lowered his gaze, but inside, his resolve only grew. He had not planned to confront Robert so publicly, but the humiliation forced his hand. Now he realized there was no turning back. Investors moved in clusters, whispering urgently, pulling out phones. Stock updates spread in seconds. The company's value had begun to plummet, bleeding millions before dessert had even been served. Politicians slipped quietly toward the exits, unwilling to be seen near the fire. Robert's voice grew louder, but the louder he shouted, the less anyone listened. For the first time, Robert saw his allies' eyes look past him as though he were already gone. The isolation pierced deeper than Michael's words. His empire was built on control, yet here he stood, unable to command even a glance of loyalty. Arrogance had carried him to the top, but arrogance had also left him alone. As the music failed to restart, the once proud ballroom transformed into a stage of ruin. The king of the evening now looked like a desperate man, clinging to a crown that had already slipped from his head. Michael finally stepped forward again, his voice calm but firm. "The truth doesn't need shouting," he said, his words carrying through the tense silence. "It stands on its own." He didn't reveal more details that night, but the seed was planted. The crowd had seen enough to doubt Robert, and doubt was more powerful than proof in moments like these. Employees in the room began to murmur, some nodding at Michael's courage. A junior accountant whispered to a colleague, "He's right, I've seen things too." Fear that once silenced them was dissolving in the wake of the waiter's bravery. One by one, whispers joined whispers, building into something Robert could no longer control. Robert roared back, "You are nothing. You serve drinks, you don't make history." But his words only underlined the truth. History was being made at that very moment, and he was powerless to stop it. The laughter he once commanded was gone, replaced by suspicion and disdain. The room's energy had shifted entirely. Michael felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, but he did not shrink. He had stepped out of invisibility, and there was no retreat. "Respect," he continued, "isn't measured by titles or money. It's measured by the way you treat people. And tonight, you've shown the world exactly who you are." His words stung sharper than any headline. The journalists, sensing a story bigger than they expected, rushed out to deliver breaking news. Phones buzzed across the room with updates, emails, and collapsing stock prices. Robert's empire wasn't just wounded. It was bleeding out in real time before the entire city could watch. And just as Michael's words carried through the hall, I want to hear your thoughts as well. If you followed this story and felt the weight of arrogance meeting truth, leave a comment below. Tell me, do you believe a single voice can really topple a giant? Your words, like Michael's, might inspire more than you know. The morning after the disastrous gala, Robert Hayes sat in the back of a black car, staring out at the streets of Manhattan. His phone buzzed non-stop, calls from furious investors, texts from board members demanding answers, emails from journalists with pointed questions. His driver asked if he wanted the news on. Robert barked, "No!" But the silence was worse, because in that silence lived the echoes of Michael's voice. At the company headquarters, the boardroom was already filled. The men and women who had once applauded Robert's leadership sat stiff and tense around the mahogany table. No one stood to greet him when he entered. Their faces carried the same message: disappointment, betrayal, and fear. Robert straightened his tie, forcing confidence, though he felt it slipping like sand through his fingers. "We have a crisis," began Linda Tran, the head of finance. "Our stock dropped 12% overnight. Investors are pulling out. The press is calling this the scandal of the decade." She pushed a stack of reports across the table. Headlines screamed from the pages: fraud allegations, rock multinational giant. Director Humiliates waiter faces public backlash. Robert glanced at them with disdain, as if by refusing to read, he could erase them. Robert tried to command the room with his voice. "This is nothing but gossip," he insisted, pounding the table. "A waiter's lies. We cannot let a nobody dictate our company's future." But the board members exchanged glances, unimpressed. For the first time, his words did not bend them to his will. Fear of collapse outweighed fear of him. His empire no longer protected him. It threatened them all. One director leaned forward, his tone icy. "The issue isn't only what he said, it's how you responded. You mocked him in public. You exposed arrogance that investors can no longer defend. Whether his claims are true or not, the damage has been done." Each sentence was a blade, cutting deeper into Robert's armor of pride. Robert clenched his fists, his jaw tight. He wanted to scream, to fire them all, to remind them who had built the empire. But deep down, he knew the truth. The empire was cracking, and even those closest to him were now more interested in saving themselves than saving him. The meeting had begun not as a crisis strategy, but as his silent trial. By the end of the week, the whispers had hardened into facts. Documents began leaking to the press, contracts signed under Robert's name, offshore accounts tied to shell companies, transfers that matched Michael's claims exactly. What began as rumor now had teeth. Reporters filled every inch of the company's lobby, cameras waiting to capture Robert's fall. In the boardroom, the atmosphere was heavier than before. Linda Tran placed a thick folder on the table, her voice steady but cold. "These came from internal servers. The press has them too. They match the allegations raised at the gala." She slid the folder toward Robert. He didn't touch it. Instead, he glared at her, as if staring could erase the pages. The board members leaned forward, scanning the evidence. "Project Aegis, Project Horizon, and half a dozen more," one muttered. "Falsified expenses, inflated numbers, kickbacks." Each revelation was a hammer blow. Robert shook his head furiously, muttering, "This is fabricated, lies, enemies trying to ruin us." But the room no longer believed him. His denial sounded like the desperation of a drowning man. Meanwhile, the press outside roared louder. Television anchors dissected the story live, social media exploded with hashtags, and ordinary people shared clips of Robert mocking Michael. The humiliation had gone viral, replayed again and again, the image of a man whose arrogance had lit his own downfall. Even those who once admired him now jeered at his name. Michael's name began appearing too, though carefully. Journalists called him the anonymous waiter-turned-whistleblower. Workers from within the company started confirming his words, trickling small pieces of truth into the storm. Every new confirmation made Robert smaller, weaker, until his once untouchable empire looked like a crumbling wall, one push away from collapse. As Robert finally opened the folder, his hands trembled. The signatures were his, the accounts undeniable. For the first time in his career, he had no defense, no clever words, no way to spin the truth. He closed the folder slowly, his face pale. The board watched in silence. At last, Robert Hayes, the man who believed he was untouchable, had been cornered by the one thing he could never overpower: evidence. Robert Hayes sat alone in his penthouse, the city lights sprawling beneath him like mocking jewels. He had once seen this view as proof of his dominance, but now it felt like a reminder of how far he had fallen. Newspapers scattered across the table carried his face on every front page. Fraud, lies, and arrogance, the fall of Robert Hayes. He turned them over, but the headlines still screamed in his mind. He poured a drink with shaking hands, staring at the reflection of a man he no longer recognized. His eyes, once sharp with ambition, now carried shadows of fear. His voice, once commanding, cracked when he spoke even to himself. He tried to summon anger, to blame the board, the press, even Michael. But deep down, he knew the truth. It was pride, his own pride, that had brought him here. Calls from allies grew fewer each day. Politicians distanced themselves, investors abandoned him, and even longtime colleagues severed ties. For decades, Robert had believed people admired him. Now, he saw the truth. They had only admired his power. Without it, he was just another man, aging, flawed, and suddenly irrelevant. His empire had crumbled, and with it, the illusion of invincibility. He replayed the night of the gala again and again in his mind. The glass shattering, the laughter, the moment he pointed at Michael with disdain. He remembered the look in the young man's eyes, not fear, but defiance. That defiance had cut deeper than any rival's attack ever had. It was the moment Robert realized, too late, that respect cannot be commanded through humiliation. The silence of the penthouse suffocated him. The laughter of investors, the clinking of glasses, the applause of boardrooms, all gone. Only the sound of his own breath remained, heavy and ragged. For a man who had once controlled everything, the loss of control was unbearable. Pride, once his weapon, had become his prison. And yet, Robert clung to scraps of arrogance. He told himself it wasn't over, that he could still fight back, rebuild, reclaim what was his. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw not a king, not a leader, but a man undone by his own reflection. Pride had been his crown, and now it was the weight that dragged him down. While Robert withered in silence, Michael Reed's life took an unexpected turn. What began as whispers in a ballroom spread like wildfire. Journalists sought him out, calling him the waiter who spoke truth to power. At first, Michael avoided the spotlight, preferring to stay in the background. But soon he realized his story had become larger than himself. His words had given courage to others. Community leaders invited him to speak, not about fraud or scandals, but about dignity. He stood before groups of workers who knew what it meant to be invisible, to be silenced, to be dismissed by the powerful. Michael spoke not as a hero, but as one of them. "I was just doing my job," he would say. But when you see arrogance crush others, silence becomes complicity. His honesty drew applause warmer than any gala ever had. News outlets highlighted his story as a modern parable, the fall of arrogance and the rise of humility. Ordinary people saw in him a reflection of their own struggles. He became a symbol of resilience, proof that even the smallest voice can shake the tallest towers. Michael hadn't sought fame, but now, everywhere he went, he inspired hope. At home, his family looked at him with pride. His mother, who had worked tirelessly to raise him, smiled with tears in her eyes. "You reminded them that respect is worth more than money," she whispered. His sister hugged him tightly, telling him that kids at school now spoke of her brother as if he were a legend. For Michael, their pride was the greatest reward. Meanwhile, other employees of Robert's company began to speak up. Whistleblowers stepped forward, adding their voices to the storm Michael had started. Together, they revealed truths long hidden under contracts and corporate gloss. The empire had not only collapsed, it was being rebuilt in the image of honesty and accountability. Michael realized that night in the ballroom had not been the end of humiliation. It had been the beginning of change. His defiance had lit a flame, and that flame had spread into a fire of justice. The invisible waiter was invisible no more. He had become the face of courage, a reminder that respect belongs to everyone, no matter how high or low they stand. The headlines no longer praised Robert Hayes. They remembered him as a warning, not a model. The arrogance that destroyed an empire became the story told in classrooms, boardrooms, and news panels. His name was no longer tied to wealth or innovation, but to downfall. The man who once believed he could not be touched had been silenced, not by rivals, but by truth. Robert, now stripped of his position and his influence, walked the streets of Manhattan unnoticed. The city that had once bowed to him now looked past him. His penthouse remained, but it was an empty cage, echoing with reminders of pride gone too far. He had not lost because of Michael. He had lost because he believed he was untouchable. That belief had been his undoing. Michael's story, however, continued to rise. Invited to interviews, community gatherings, and conferences, he spoke with the humility of someone who had never sought the spotlight. "I wasn't trying to destroy a man," he said once. "I was trying to remind him, and everyone, that respect is not optional." His words resonated because they were simple, human, and true. People listened. Workers found courage in his story. Executives reconsidered how they treated those beneath them, and young people looked to him as proof that one voice could matter. He had become a symbol of integrity in a world where power often drowned out honesty. And for Michael, the greatest victory was not fame, but the knowledge that he had defended dignity. In the end, the story of that gala became more than a scandal. It was a reminder that empires are fragile, that arrogance can collapse under its own weight, and that sometimes the most powerful man in the room is not the one standing at the podium, but the one who dares to speak the truth. And as Michael's voice still echoes, I turn to you. What do you take from this story? Do you believe arrogance always leads to downfall, or can pride be redeemed? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story touched you, subscribe to the channel so you'll never miss the next journey of truth, courage, and redemption.